Broken Oaths Mended. Fleeing an unwanted betrothal, Lady Beatrice of Blackmere found herself at the mercy of Sir Geoffrey de Moray, the exiled knight known as the Wolf of the North. He watched her from across the fire, his voice rough with warning. "You have entered my lands, my lady," he murmured. "Now, I decide what becomes of you." Chapter 1. The Flight from Blackmere. The tapestry of the night was woven with threads of fear and desperation, each gust of wind a whispered threat against Lady Beatrice of Blackmere's back. Her breath plumed out in white clouds, mirroring the frantic beat of her heart. The heavy wool cloak, borrowed from a sympathetic kitchen maid, did little to ward off the bone-chilling November air, but it did conceal the fine silk of her gown, a stark reminder of the life she was leaving behind. Blackmere Castle, with its towering walls and familiar comforts, was now a prison she had willingly escaped. The muddy track beneath her worn leather boots was treacherous, slick with the remnants of a recent rain. She stumbled, catching herself on the rough bark of a skeletal oak, its branches clawing at the bruised, pre-dawn sky. The scent of damp earth and decaying leaves filled her nostrils, a world away from the perfumed chambers and stifling expectations of her betrothed, Lord Elric of Ashworth. He was a man twice her age, with eyes that held the cold gleam of ambition rather than affection, and a reputation for cruelty that whispered through the castle halls like a chilling draught. The marriage contract, a gilded cage crafted by her father, Lord Reginald, had been signed and sealed weeks ago. It was a strategic alliance, a merging of lands and power, a sacrifice of his only daughter for the greater good of Blackmere. Beatrice understood the necessity, the weight of duty that pressed upon her shoulders like the heavy stones of the castle walls. But understanding did not equate to acceptance. The thought of Elric's touch, his possessive gaze, sent a shiver of revulsion down her spine. She had pleaded, reasoned, even threatened, but her father remained unmoved. His face, usually etched with a weary affection, had become a mask of stony resolve. "It is for the best, Beatrice," he had said, his voice devoid of warmth. "Elric is a powerful man. He will protect you, provide for you." But protection, in Beatrice's eyes, was another word for imprisonment. The escape had been meticulously planned, aided by old Nan, the castle's ancient herbalist, and Alara, the young kitchen maid who had a heart as vast as the sprawling kitchens she tended. Old Nan, with her wrinkled face and knowing eyes, had provided a sleeping draught for the guards patrolling the postern gate and a vial of a potent tonic to ward off the cold. Alara, her cheeks flushed with a mixture of fear and excitement, had supplied the cloak, a sturdy pair of boots, and a pouch filled with dried meat and bread. "Go north, my lady," Alara had whispered, her voice trembling. "Seek out Ravenswood. They say the Wolf of the North is a hard man, but a just one. He may offer you sanctuary." The Wolf of the North. Sir Geoffrey de Moray. The name echoed in Beatrice's mind, a mixture of fear and a flicker of desperate hope. He was a legend whispered in hushed tones, a knight exiled from court for a crime he swore he did not commit, a man who ruled his remote northern lands with an iron fist and a rumored heart of ice. He was her last, desperate gamble. The forest grew denser, the trees looming like silent sentinels, their branches intertwined, blocking out what little light remained. Fear, cold and sharp, gnawed at her resolve. She had never been beyond the castle walls without an escort, without the protection of her family name and title. Now, she was merely Beatrice, a woman alone in the wilderness, stripped of all pretense, vulnerable and exposed. She pressed on, driven by the image of Elric's face, his cold, calculating eyes. The memory fueled her weary limbs, pushing her deeper into the unknown. She had to reach Ravenswood. She had to find the wolf. As dawn finally broke, painting the sky in hues of pale gray and hesitant pink, she saw it. A plume of smoke rising in the distance, a faint, beckoning signal against the vast expanse of the forest. Hope, fragile but tenacious, bloomed in her chest. It was a small thing, a wisp of smoke, but it was enough. Enough to keep her moving, enough to believe that she might, just might, find a haven from the storm that raged both within and without. The faint, almost imperceptible scent of wood smoke, carried on the crisp morning air, was the most beautiful perfume she had ever known. It smelled of survival. It smelled, faintly, of hope. The trees were beginning to thin, revealing glimpses of rolling hills and, far in the distance, the jagged peaks of mountains capped with the first snows of winter. She was close. She had to be. Her legs ached, her feet were blistered, and her stomach gnawed with hunger, but she dared not stop. Not yet. Not until she reached the source of that smoke, the promise of warmth, and perhaps, just perhaps, sanctuary. Suddenly, a twig snapped behind her. Beatrice whirled around, her heart leaping into her throat. Two men, clad in rough-spun tunics and leather jerkins, emerged from the trees. Their faces were grim, their eyes hard. One carried a hunting bow, the other a crudely fashioned club. They were not knights, nor did they bear the livery of any noble house she recognized. They were poachers or worse, brigands. And they had found her. One of the men, the one with a club and a cruel scar across his left cheek, opened his mouth to speak, and Beatrice, her decision automatic, ran. Chapter 2. Into the wolf's domain. Beatrice ran, her lungs burning, her legs screaming in protest. The rough terrain, a tapestry of tangled roots and loose stones, conspired against her, but the primal fear of capture spurred her onward. Behind her, she could hear the heavy footfalls of the brigands, their crude laughter a chilling counterpoint to the desperate pounding of her heart. The forest, once a potential refuge, had become a hunting ground. She risked a glance over her shoulder. They were gaining. The man with the scar was closer now, his face twisted in a predatory grin. She stumbled, her ankle twisting beneath her, sending a searing pain shooting up her leg. She cried out, a choked sob escaping her lips. She fell, the damp earth cold and unforgiving against her cheek. Despair, black and suffocating, threatened to engulf her. This was it, then. Her flight, her desperate gamble, had ended here, in the mud and the muck, at the mercy of these brutes. She closed her eyes, bracing herself for the inevitable. But the blow never came. Instead, she heard a roar, a sound so primal and ferocious that it seemed to shake the very ground beneath her. It was a sound that spoke of untamed power, of a wildness that mirrored the untamed landscape. Then, the clash of steel, the grunts of men in brutal combat, the sickening thud of flesh meeting flesh. Slowly, cautiously, she opened her eyes. Standing between her and the brigands was a figure that seemed to have emerged from the very heart of the forest itself. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his movements fluid and deadly. He wore no shining armor, but a jerkin of dark leather and a cloak the color of a winter storm. His hair was the color of ravens' wings, long and untamed, framing a face that was both strikingly handsome and utterly ruthless. His eyes, the color of a glacial lake, were fixed on the brigands with a cold, unwavering intensity. He wielded a sword, not the ornate, jewel-encrusted weapon of a courtly knight, but a blade that looked as if it had seen countless battles, its edge honed to a deadly sharpness. It moved with a terrifying grace, deflecting blows, parrying attacks, a whirlwind of steel that kept the brigands at bay. The fight was short, brutal, and decisive. The man with the scar fell first, a choked gurgle escaping his lips as the dark-haired warrior's blade found its mark. The other brigand, seeing his companion fall, hesitated for a moment, his eyes wide with fear. He turned to flee, but the warrior was too quick. With a speed that belied his size, he closed the distance, his sword flashing in the dappled sunlight. The brigand crumpled to the ground, a silent testament to the warrior's deadly skill. Silence descended, broken only by Beatrice's ragged breathing and the rustling of the leaves. The warrior turned, his glacial eyes fixing on her. She flinched, expecting to see the same predatory gleam she had seen in the brigand's eyes, but instead, she saw something else. Something that made her breath catch in her throat. It wasn't kindness, not exactly, but a kind of grim assessment, a weighing of her worth, a calculation of the threat she posed. He sheathed his sword, the metallic rasp echoing in the stillness. He approached her slowly, deliberately, like a predator approaching its prey. She scrambled back, her hands scraping against the rough ground, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and a strange, unsettling fascination. He stopped a few feet away, his shadow falling over her like a shroud. He was even more imposing up close, his presence filling the small clearing, his scent a mixture of leather, steel, and the wild, untamed essence of the forest itself. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice a low rumble, roughened by the wind and the wild. It was a voice that demanded obedience, a voice that spoke of power and authority. She struggled to find her voice, her throat dry and constricted. I am Lady Beatrice of Blackmere," she managed to whisper, the title sounding hollow and meaningless in this wild place. His eyes narrowed, a flicker of something unreadable passing across his face. "Blackmere," he repeated, the name sounding like a curse on his lips. "And what brings a lady of Blackmere to my lands, fleeing like a frightened doe?" I am seeking sanctuary," she stammered, her gaze dropping to the muddy ground. She could meet his eyes, those piercing, glacial eyes that seemed to see straight through her. He let out a harsh laugh, a sound devoid of humor. "Sanctuary? Here? You think you will find sanctuary in Ravenswood?" She lifted her head, her chin trembling, but her eyes meeting his with a newfound defiance. I was told that the Wolf of the North was a just man." His expression hardened, his jaw tightening. "The Wolf of the North," he repeated, the title dripping with bitterness. "That is what they call me, is it? A beast, an outcast, a man to be feared." He took a step closer, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous murmur. "You have entered my lands, my lady," he murmured. "Now I decide what becomes of you." He reached down, not to harm her, but to offer his large, calloused hand. The gesture was unexpected, and for a long moment, Beatrice simply stared at it, a mixture of terror and fragile trust warring within her. The decision to take it, she knew, would change everything. Chapter 3. A bargain struck in shadow. Beatrice hesitated, her gaze flickering between his outstretched hand and his face. His eyes, though still holding that unsettling intensity, seemed to lack the immediate threat she had initially perceived. There was a weariness there, too, a hint of a burden carried, a shadow that clung to him like the perpetual twilight of the deep forest. It was that flicker of vulnerability, perhaps, that gave her the courage to reach out. Her fingers, slender and pale against his large, calloused hand, trembled as she placed them in his grasp. His grip was strong, surprisingly gentle, but undeniably firm. He pulled her to her feet with an ease that spoke of his inherent strength. She swayed slightly, her injured ankle protesting, but he steadied her, his hand lingering on her arm for a moment longer than necessary. The contact sent a shiver through her, a strange mixture of fear and something else, something she couldn't quite name. He released her, stepping back, his gaze sweeping over her, taking in the torn silk of her gown, the mud staining her cloak, the exhaustion etched on her face. "You are injured," he stated, his voice losing some of its harshness. It was not a question, but an observation. "My ankle," she admitted, wincing as she put weight on it. "It is nothing." He raised an eyebrow, a flicker of amusement, or perhaps disbelief, crossing his features. "Nothing? You can barely stand." He gestured towards a fallen log nearby. "Seat." "Let me see." She hesitated, but the throbbing pain in her ankle and the sheer exhaustion weighing her down made the decision for her. She limped over to the log and sat, pulling her cloak around her, suddenly aware of how disheveled and vulnerable she must appear. He knelt before her, his movements surprisingly graceful for such a large man. He gently lifted the hem of her skirt, revealing the swollen, discolored flesh around her ankle. His fingers, surprisingly gentle, probed the injury, his touch sending a jolt of pain through her, but also a strange, unexpected warmth. "It is not broken," he said, his voice low and thoughtful, "but badly sprained. You will not be walking far on this." She looked at him, her eyes searching his. "What? What will you do?" He met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "You seek sanctuary, Lady Beatrice, and I am a man in need of certain services." A knot of apprehension tightened in her stomach. "Services?" she repeated, her voice barely a whisper. "What kind of services?" He stood, his height once again dominating her. "Ravenswood is a harsh land, Lady Beatrice. My people are wary of outsiders. They need to be reassured. They need to see that I am not the monster whispered about in the South." He paused, his gaze locking with hers. "You are a lady of noble birth. Your presence here, your acceptance of my hospitality, could help quell their fears, ease their suspicions." She understood. He was using her. Her title, her lineage, her very presence, was a tool to be wielded in his own game of power and control. But what choice did she have? She was alone, injured, and at his mercy.
"And in return?"
she asked, her voice steadier now, her pride battling with her fear. He smiled, a slow, deliberate smile that did not quite reach his eyes. "In return, I will offer you my protection. I will see that you are fed, clothed, and sheltered. I will ensure that no harm comes to you within the walls of Ravenswood." He paused, his gaze hardening. "And I will keep you safe from Lord Elric, should he come looking for his runaway bride." The mention of Elric's name sent a shiver of dread down her spine. The thought of being returned to him, of facing his cold, possessive gaze, was more terrifying than anything she had encountered in the forest. It was a bargain, struck in the shadow of the trees, sealed with a mixture of desperation and a flicker of hope. She was a pawn in his game, yes, but she was also a survivor. And she would use this opportunity, this unexpected alliance, to forge her own path, to find her own strength. "I accept," she said, her voice clear and firm, her chin lifted in defiance. "I will be your guest, Sir Geoffrey, but I am not a prisoner, and I will not be used." He inclined his head, a flicker of respect, perhaps even admiration, in his eyes. "A fair bargain, Lady Beatrice. Welcome to Ravenswood." He offered his arm, and this time, she took it without hesitation. He helped her to her feet, supporting her weight as they began the slow, arduous trek towards the distant plume of smoke, towards the fortress that would be both her refuge and her prison, towards the man who was both her captor and her savior. The Wolf of the North had taken her in. And now, her fate was inextricably linked to his. The path ahead was uncertain, shrouded in mist and shadow, but for the first time since fleeing Blackmere, Beatrice felt a flicker of something akin to hope. It was a fragile thing, easily extinguished, but it burned within her, a tiny ember in the vast, unforgiving wilderness. She would protect that ember, nurture it, and perhaps, just perhaps, it would grow into a flame. Chapter 4. Scars of the Past. The approach to Ravenswood was a slow, agonizing journey. Beatrice's ankle throbbed with every step, and even with Sir Geoffrey's support, she could barely manage a slow limp. He, in turn, seemed to possess an endless supply of patience, adjusting his pace to hers without complaint, his strong arm a constant, reassuring presence. The landscape was stark and unforgiving, a tapestry of rolling hills and dense forests, the peaks of distant mountains capped with snow. The air was crisp and cold, carrying the scent of pine and wood smoke, a constant reminder of the wildness that surrounded them. It was a world away from the manicured gardens and sheltered courtyards of Blackmere, a world that demanded strength and resilience. As they walked, a silence settled between them, broken only by the rustling of leaves and the occasional cry of a hawk circling overhead. It was not an uncomfortable silence, but rather a watchful one, a period of assessment, a weighing of one another. Beatrice found herself studying him, trying to decipher the enigma that was the Wolf of the North. His face, etched with the harsh lines of a life lived outdoors, was undeniably handsome, but it was a beauty marred by a certain hardness, a weariness that seemed to cling to him like a shroud. There were scars, too, subtle but visible. A thin, white line that traced its way across his jaw, another that disappeared beneath the collar of his tunic. Reminders of battles fought, of wounds sustained, of a past that clearly haunted him. She wondered about the crime that had led to his exile, the whispers that painted him as a traitor, a murderer. She had heard the stories, the rumors that circulated through the court, tales of a man who had betrayed his king, who had stained his honor with blood. But looking at him now, at the quiet strength in his bearing, at the weariness in his eyes, she found it difficult to reconcile those tales with the man before her. He, in turn, seemed to be studying her, his glacial eyes assessing, probing, searching for something she couldn't quite decipher. She wondered what he saw, what he thought of the runaway bride who had stumbled into his domain, seeking sanctuary. Did he see her as a pawn, a tool to be used? Or was there something more, a flicker of understanding, perhaps even empathy, beneath that hardened exterior? As they neared Ravenswood, the fortress finally came into view. It was not the imposing, fairy tale castle she had imagined, but rather a stark, functional structure, built for defense rather than beauty. Its walls were of gray stone, weathered and scarred, rising from the crest of a hill, overlooking the surrounding valley. It was a fortress that spoke of strength and resilience, a reflection of the man who ruled it. The gates, massive and imposing, were opened as they approached, revealing a courtyard bustling with activity. Men at arms, clad in leather and chainmail, went about their duties, their eyes following Beatrice with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. Women, their faces weathered and lined, paused in their tasks to stare, their expressions wary, their whispers barely audible. Geoffrey led her through the courtyard, his hand still resting lightly on her arm, a gesture that was both protective and possessive. He nodded to a few of the men, acknowledging their presence, but he did not stop to speak. He led her towards the main keep, a towering structure of stone and timber, its entrance guarded by two massive wooden doors. Inside, the keep was surprisingly warm, the air thick with the scent of wood smoke and roasted meat. A large fire crackled in a massive hearth, casting flickering shadows on the stone walls. Tapestries, depicting scenes of hunting and battle, hung from the walls, adding a touch of color and warmth to the otherwise austere surroundings. He led her to a chamber, small but comfortable, furnished with a simple wooden bed, a chest, and a table. A fire burned brightly in the hearth, chasing away the chill. "Rest," he said, his voice softer now, less guarded. "You are safe here." She looked at him, her eyes searching his. "Thank you," she said, her voice sincere. He nodded, his gaze lingering on her for a moment longer than necessary. Then, he turned to leave, but paused at the doorway, his back to her. "The stories you have heard about me, Lady Beatrice," he said, his voice low and rough, "they are not entirely untrue. I have done things I regret. I have scars, both visible and unseen." He turned his head, his glacial eyes meeting hers. "But I am not the monster they paint me to be." And with that, he was gone, leaving her alone in the chamber, surrounded by the silence of the ancient fortress, the weight of his words hanging heavy in the air. The scars of the past, both his and hers, were a tangible presence in the room, a reminder of the wounds that needed healing, of the trust that needed to be earned. And as she sank onto the bed, exhausted but strangely hopeful, she knew that her journey had just begun. The fire crackled, casting dancing shadows on the walls, and for the first time since leaving Blackmere, Beatrice felt a flicker of warmth, not just from the flames, but from within. It was a fragile warmth, easily extinguished, but it was there, a testament to her resilience, to her refusal to be broken. She closed her eyes, listening to the sounds of the fortress, the distant clang of metal, the murmur of voices, the crackling of the fire. And she dreamed, not of escape, but of finding a place, a purpose, a home, within the walls of Ravenswood. She dreamed of healing, of forgiveness, of a second chance. And most surprisingly, She dreamed of the wolf, his glacial eyes softening, his scars fading, his heart, perhaps, thawing in the warmth of a newfound trust. Chapter 5. The Whispers of Ravenswood. The first few days at Ravenswood were a blur of unfamiliar faces, hushed whispers, and wary glances. Beatrice was treated with a cautious respect, a deference due to her title, but there was an undercurrent of suspicion, a palpable sense of unease that permeated the fortress. She was an outsider, a stranger in a close-knit community, and the whispers followed her like shadows. She spent much of her time confined to her chamber, her ankles slowly healing under the care of Maud, a stern-faced but surprisingly gentle woman who served as Ravenswood's healer. Maud, with her wrinkled hands and knowing eyes, was a font of local lore and gossip, and from her, Beatrice began to piece together the fragmented history of Sir Geoffrey de Moray and the isolated community he ruled. He was a great warrior, once, Maud said, her voice low and raspy as she applied a poultice of herbs to Beatrice's ankle. A favorite of the king, they say, until she trailed off, her eyes clouding over with a mixture of sadness and disapproval. Until what? Beatrice prompted, her curiosity piqued. Maud hesitated, her gaze flickering towards the door, as if afraid of being overheard. Until he was accused of treason, she whispered. Of plotting against the king, of murdering his own brother. Beatrice felt a chill run down her spine. The rumors she had heard in the south were true, then. Or, at least, partially true. But he denies it, doesn't he? She asked, remembering the bitterness in Geoffrey's voice when he had spoken of his past. Maud shrugged, her expression noncommittal. He does. But the king believed otherwise. He was stripped of his titles, his lands, his honor. He was banished, exiled to this remote corner of the realm. And his people? What do they believe? Maud's gaze met hers, her eyes filled with a strange mixture of loyalty and fear. They believe in him, she said simply. They trust him. He has protected them, provided for them. He is their lord, their protector, their wolf. The whispers, Beatrice realized, were not just about her. They were about Geoffrey, about the shadow of his past that hung over him, over Ravenswood. He was a man living under a cloud of suspicion, a man trying to rebuild his life, his reputation, in the face of overwhelming odds. She saw him infrequently during those first few days. He was a busy man, occupied with the running of his estate, the training of his men, the endless tasks that demanded his attention. But when she did see him, it was always from a distance, across the courtyard, or in the great hall during the evening meal. He would acknowledge her presence with a nod, a brief glance, but he did not approach her, did not speak to her. It was during one of those evening meals, as she sat alone at a small table near the hearth, that she first noticed the stares, the whispers, directed not at her, but at Geoffrey. He sat at the high table, his back straight, his expression unreadable, but she could sense the tension in his shoulders, the tightness around his mouth. He was aware of the whispers, of the scrutiny, and it clearly pained him. She saw a young woman, Elara's age, perhaps, approach him, her head bowed, her voice barely audible. He listened intently, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword, a gesture that was both protective and threatening. The woman finished speaking, and Geoffrey nodded, his expression grim. He dismissed her with a few words, and she retreated, her eyes downcast. Beatrice watched him, her heart aching for the loneliness she saw in his eyes, the burden he carried. She understood, perhaps better than anyone, what it was like to be judged, to be whispered about, to be an outsider. And in that moment, she felt a connection to him, a shared understanding that transcended their different circumstances, their different pasts. Later that evening, as she was preparing for bed, there was a knock at her door. She opened it to find Geoffrey standing there, his face shadowed in the dim light of the corridor. "May I come in?" he asked, his voice low and hesitant. She stepped aside, allowing him to enter. He stood awkwardly in the center of the room, his hands clasped behind his back, his gaze avoiding hers. I wanted to apologize," he said, his voice rough. "For the whispers, for the stares. My people are wary of outsiders." She looked at him, her expression softening. I understand, she said. It is not your fault. He finally met her gaze, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and something else, something she couldn't quite decipher.
It is, he said.
I am responsible for their fears, for their suspicions. I am the one who brought the shadow of my past to Ravenswood. He looked away, his jaw tightening, his fists clenching at his sides. The vulnerability she had glimpsed before was there again, raw and exposed. And in that moment, Beatrice knew that she could no longer remain a passive observer, a pawn in his game. She had to help him, to ease his burden, to dispel the shadows that clung to him. She had to find a way to silence the whispers of Ravenswood, not just for his sake, but for her own. For she was beginning to realize that her fate, her future, was inextricably linked to his, to the redemption of the Wolf of the North. She took a step toward him, a glimmer of determination in her eyes, a resolve hardening in her heart. The whispers were a challenge, and one she was finally ready to meet head-on. Chapter 6. A Glimmer of Trust. Beatrice took a step closer, her hand reaching out instinctively, a gesture of comfort, of understanding. She stopped herself just before her fingers brushed his arm, a sudden awareness of the impropriety, of the chasm of social standing that still separated them, holding her back. It is not your fault, she repeated, her voice soft but firm. The past is the past. You cannot change what happened, but you can change how you live now. You can show everyone who you truly are. He looked at her, his glacial eyes searching hers, a flicker of surprise, perhaps even hope, crossing his features. And how do I do that, Lady Beatrice? How do I erase the stain of my past, the whispers that follow me like shadows? She hesitated, considering her words carefully. She knew that she was treading on dangerous ground, that she was risking his wrath, his rejection. But she also knew that she had to speak her mind, to offer him the truth, as she saw it. By being the man you want to be, she said, her voice gaining strength. By being just, by being fair, by being kind. By showing them that you are not the monster they fear, but a leader they can trust, a protector they can rely on. He let out a harsh laugh, a sound devoid of humor. Kindness? In this world, kindness is a weakness, Lady Beatrice. It is a luxury I cannot afford. Perhaps, she conceded, but it is also a strength. It takes courage to be kind, to be compassionate, in a world that is often cruel and unforgiving. It takes strength to forgive, to move on, to build a new life. He was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on her, his expression unreadable. She wondered if she had gone too far, if she had overstepped her bounds. But then he spoke, his voice softer now, less guarded. You speak from experience, Lady Beatrice? He asked, his eyes searching hers. She nodded, her gaze dropping to the floor, a wave of sadness washing over her. I do, she admitted. I have made mistakes, I have regrets. I have been judged unfairly by others. I know what it is like to carry the weight of the past, to feel the sting of betrayal, the pain of loss. He took a step closer, his voice barely a whisper.
Tell me, he said.
Tell me about your past, about the scars you carry. And so she did. She told him about Lord Elric, about the unwanted betrothal, about her desperate flight from Blackmere. She told him about her father, about his unwavering belief in duty and honor, about his inability to see her as anything other than a pawn in his political games. She told him about her fears, her doubts, her hopes for a different future, a future where she could be free to choose her own path, to live her own life. As she spoke, she felt a weight lifting from her shoulders, a burden she had carried for so long, finally being released. And as she looked at Geoffrey, at the empathy in his eyes, at the understanding in his expression, she realized that she was not alone. He understood. He had walked a similar path. He had faced similar challenges. He had carried similar burdens. When she finished, he was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on her, his expression thoughtful. Thank you, he said finally, his voice sincere, for sharing your story with me, for trusting me. It was the first time he had used the word trust, and it sent a shiver of warmth through her, a fragile but undeniable connection forming between them. He reached out, his hand gently touching her cheek, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw. It was a brief, innocent touch, but it sent a jolt of electricity through her, a sensation she had not expected, had not anticipated. He withdrew his hand quickly, as if realizing the impropriety of his gesture. He cleared his throat, his gaze avoiding hers. "It is late," he said, his voice rough. "You should rest." She nodded, her heart pounding in her chest, her cheeks flushed. She watched him as he turned to leave, his back straight, his shoulders squared, but she could sense the vulnerability beneath his hardened exterior, the loneliness that haunted him. As he reached the door, he paused, his hand on the latch. He turned his head, his glacial eyes meeting hers. "Perhaps," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "perhaps you are right, Lady Beatrice. Perhaps kindness is not a weakness. Perhaps it is a glimmer of hope." And with that, he was gone, leaving her alone in the chamber, the echo of his words hanging in the air, a promise of something more, something fragile but precious, a glimmer of trust in the darkness of Ravenswood. The fire had burned down to embers, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls, but Beatrice felt a warmth within her, a warmth that had nothing to do with the flames. It was the warmth of connection, of understanding, of a shared vulnerability, of a hope for a future that was no longer quite so bleak, quite so uncertain. She smiled, a small, tentative smile, but a smile nonetheless. The wolf of the north had shown her a glimpse of his heart, and it was not as cold, as icy, as she had feared. It was a heart that had been wounded, yes, but it was a heart that was still capable of feeling, of caring, of perhaps even loving. And that, she realized, was all the hope she needed. Chapter 7. The Serpent in the Garden. The tentative trust that had begun to blossom between Beatrice and Geoffrey was soon tested by the arrival of an unexpected guest. A raven arrived from the south, bearing a message sealed with the crest of Lord Elric of Ashworth. The message was short, blunt, and demanding: return Lady Beatrice to Blackmere immediately, or face the consequences. Geoffrey read the message aloud in the great hall, his voice cold and devoid of emotion. The assembled members of his household listened in silence, their eyes fixed on Beatrice, their expressions a mixture of apprehension and curiosity. She felt their gaze upon her, a palpable weight of expectation, of judgment. "What will you do?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper, her heart pounding in her chest. He looked at her, his glacial eyes unreadable. "I gave you my word, Lady Beatrice," he said, his voice firm. "I offered you sanctuary. I will not break that promise." Relief washed over her, a wave of gratitude so intense that it brought tears to her eyes. But she also knew that his decision would not come without a cost. Lord Elric was a powerful man, a man not to be trifled with. He would not take kindly to Geoffrey's defiance. "He will come for me," she said, her voice trembling. "He will not let me go so easily." Geoffrey nodded, his expression grim. "I know, and we will be ready for him." He dismissed the assembly, ordering them to prepare for a possible siege. He then turned to Beatrice, his voice softening. "You will be safe here," he said. "I will not let him take you." But despite his reassurances, Beatrice could not shake the feeling of unease that settled over her. She knew that Elric was not the only threat she faced. There were whispers within Ravenswood, whispers of discontent, of dissent. There were those who believed that harboring her was a mistake, that it would bring ruin upon them all. One of those voices belonged to Osric, Geoffrey's cousin, a man with a lean, hungry look and eyes that held a cold, calculating gleam. Osric had been Geoffrey's closest confidant, his second in command, but since Beatrice's arrival, she had sensed a growing resentment in him, a simmering jealousy that threatened to boil over. She had overheard him arguing with Geoffrey, his voice low and urgent. "She is a danger to us all," Osric had said. "She will bring the wrath of Ashworth down upon us. We should send her back, before it is too late." Geoffrey had refused, his voice firm and unwavering. "She is under my protection," he had said. "I will not betray my word." But Osric had not been convinced. And Beatrice knew that he was a dangerous enemy, a serpent in the garden, waiting for the opportune moment to strike. She tried to warn Geoffrey, to tell him of her suspicions, but he dismissed her concerns, his mind preoccupied with the preparations for Elric's arrival. "Osric is loyal," he said. "He would never betray me." Beatrice hoped he was right, but she could not shake the feeling that he was wrong, that he was blind to the danger that lurked within his own walls. As the days passed, the tension within Ravenswood grew. The men at arms drilled relentlessly, their movements sharp and precise. The women stocked the storerooms, preparing for a long siege. The air was thick with anticipation, with fear, with the unspoken question of what the future held. Beatrice found herself drawn to the chapel, a small, stone structure tucked away in a quiet corner of the courtyard. She spent hours there, praying for guidance, for strength, for the safety of Ravenswood and its people. She prayed for Geoffrey, for his protection, for his redemption. One evening, as she was leaving the chapel, she encountered Osric. He stood in the shadows, his face hidden in the dim light, his eyes fixed on her. "You should leave, Lady Beatrice," he said, his voice low and menacing. "You are not welcome here. You bring nothing but trouble." She must not betray the fear that she felt inside her chest. "I am here under Sir Geoffrey's protection," she replied. "Protection?" Osric scoffed. "He cannot protect you. He cannot even protect himself." He took a step closer, his hand reaching out, his fingers brushing her arm. She flinched, stepping back, her heart pounding in her chest. "Leave," he repeated, his voice a harsh whisper. "Leave, before it is too late. Before you bring us all to ruin." He turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows, leaving Beatrice alone in the gathering darkness, the chill of his words clinging to her like a shroud. She knew that he was right. She was a danger to Ravenswood. But she also knew that she could not leave, that she could not abandon Geoffrey, that she could not break the fragile bond of trust that had formed between them. She was trapped, caught between two powerful forces, between two dangerous men, between her past and her future. And she had no idea how to escape. The serpent had spoken, and its venomous words had poisoned the fragile peace of Ravenswood. Chapter 8. Revelations by Firelight. Osric's warning, delivered with such chilling conviction, left Beatrice shaken. She retreated to her chamber, the heavy oak door feeling less like a barrier and more like a confirmation of her isolation. The fire in the hearth had burned low, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to mimic the turmoil within her. She added more wood, watching as the flames leaped and crackled, their warmth a small comfort in the face of the growing unease that consumed her. She knew she had to speak to Geoffrey, to tell him of Osric's threat, despite his previous dismissal of her concerns. But she hesitated, unsure of how to approach him, how to convince him of the danger that lurked within his own walls. She paced the room, her mind racing, her thoughts a tangled web of fear and uncertainty. A knock at the door startled her. She opened it cautiously, her hand resting on the small dagger she had taken to keeping hidden beneath her pillow. It was Geoffrey. He looked weary, his face etched with the strain of the past few days. He had been overseeing the preparations for the impending siege, ensuring that Ravenswood was as secure as possible. "May I come in?" he asked, his voice low and hesitant. She stepped aside, allowing him to enter. He stood awkwardly in the center of the room, his hands clasped behind his back, his gaze avoiding hers. "I came to see how you were," he said, his voice rough. After Osric spoke to you." She looked at him, surprised. "How did you know?" He sighed, running a hand through his dark hair.
"He told me," he said.
"He said he was concerned for your safety. He suggested that you might be happier elsewhere." Beatrice felt a surge of anger, of frustration. "He threatened me," she said, her voice trembling. "He told me to leave, that I was a danger to Ravenswood, that I would bring ruin upon you all." Geoffrey's expression hardened, his jaw tightening. "He overstepped," he said, his voice cold. "He had no right." "But he is right, isn't he?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "I am a danger to you. Elric is coming. He will not stop until he has me back. He took a step closer, his glacial eyes meeting hers. I will not let him take you, he repeated, his voice firm. I gave you my word. But at what cost? She cried, her voice breaking. Your people, your home, everything you have built, it could all be destroyed because of me. He reached out, his hand gently touching her cheek, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw. It was a gesture of comfort, of reassurance, but it also sent a shiver of awareness through her, a reminder of the unspoken feelings that simmered beneath the surface. It is worth the risk, he said, his voice low and husky. You are worth the risk. She looked at him, her eyes searching his, a flicker of hope, of disbelief, crossing her features.
Why?
She whispered. Why are you doing this? Why are you risking everything for me? He hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor, a struggle evident in his expression. He opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again, as if unsure of how to put his feelings into words. The fire crackled, casting flickering shadows on the walls, creating an intimate, almost conspiratorial atmosphere. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken emotions, with unanswered questions. Finally, he spoke, his voice raw with vulnerability. Because he began, then stopped, taking a deep breath. Because I care for you, Beatrice. More than I should.
More than is wise.
More than is safe. The words hung in the air, a confession that changed everything. Beatrice felt her heart leap in her chest, a mixture of shock, disbelief, and a burgeoning joy. She had not expected this, had not dared to hope for it. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of longing and fear. I know it is wrong, he said, his voice barely a whisper. I am the wolf of the north, an outcast, a man with a stained reputation. You are a lady of noble birth, destined for a different life. But I don't want a different life, she said, her voice trembling. I don't want the life that was chosen for me. I want she couldn't say it, couldn't put her own feelings into words, but she didn't need to. He understood. He reached out, cupping her face in his hands, his thumbs gently stroking her cheeks. He leaned in, his breath warm against her skin, his eyes searching hers, asking a silent question. She closed the distance between them, her lips meeting his in a tentative, hesitant kiss. It was a kiss that spoke of longing, of fear, of forbidden desire, of a hope for a future that seemed impossible, but was now, suddenly, within reach. It was a kiss that sealed their fate, that bound them together, in the face of the storm that was gathering on the horizon. The revelations by firelight had changed everything. The unspoken had been spoken, the hidden revealed. And as they clung to each other, seeking solace and strength in each other's arms, they knew that they would face the future together, whatever it may hold. Chapter 9. The Price of Loyalty. The kiss, a moment of shared vulnerability and burgeoning hope, was shattered by a sudden, urgent pounding on the door. Geoffrey broke away, his expression instantly shifting from tenderness to alarm. He strode to the door, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. Who is it? He demanded, his voice sharp and commanding. It is I, my lord, a voice replied, breathless and urgent. It is Bran. The scouts have returned. Lord Elric is here. Geoffrey's face hardened, his jaw tightening. He looked at Beatrice, his eyes filled with a mixture of regret and determination. Stay here, he said, his voice firm. Lock the door. Do not open it for anyone but me. She nodded, her heart pounding in her chest, her fear battling with a newfound sense of resolve. She would not be a passive victim, a damsel in distress. She would be strong, she would be brave, she would face whatever came, alongside the man she was beginning to love. He squeezed her hand, a brief, reassuring gesture, then turned and left the chamber, the heavy oak door closing behind him with a resounding thud. She locked it, her hands trembling, then leaned against it, listening to the sounds of the fortress, the hurried footsteps, the clang of metal, the shouted commands. The siege had begun. She waited, her senses on high alert, her mind racing. She thought of Geoffrey, of his courage, his strength, his unexpected tenderness. She thought of Osric, of his betrayal, of the danger he posed. She thought of Elric, of his cruelty, of the fate that awaited her if she were to fall into his hands. Time stretched on, an eternity of waiting, of uncertainty, of fear. The sounds of battle grew louder, closer, the clash of steel, the cries of men, the thud of bodies, a symphony of violence that echoed through the stone walls of Ravenswood. Suddenly, there was a different sound, a scraping, scratching sound at her window. She whirled around, her heart leaping into her throat, her hand instinctively reaching for the dagger beneath her pillow. The window, small and barred, was slowly being pried open. A figure, silhouetted against the dim light of the moon, squeezed through the opening, dropping silently to the floor. It was Osric. He smiled, a cold, cruel smile that sent a shiver of dread down her spine. "I told you to leave, Lady Beatrice," he said, his voice low and menacing. "But you did not listen. What do you want?" she asked, her voice trembling, but her grip on the dagger firm. "I want what is best for Ravenswood," he said. "And that means getting rid of you." He advanced towards her, his hand reaching into his tunic, pulling out a dagger of his own. The moonlight glinted off the polished steel, a deadly reflection of his intent. "Geoffrey will not allow this," she said, her voice gaining strength, her fear fueled by a surge of adrenaline. Osric gave her a look as cold as ice. "Geoffrey," he said slowly, "will not be in any position to help you." She lunged, her movements desperate but surprisingly swift. The dagger in her hand grazed his arm, drawing a thin line of blood. He cried out, more in surprise than pain, and stumbled back. "You will pay for that," he snarled, his eyes filled with rage. He lunged at her, his dagger aimed at her heart. She dodged, narrowly avoiding the blow, but he was too quick, too strong. He grabbed her arm, twisting it behind her back, forcing her to drop the dagger. He pushed her against the wall, his body pressing against hers, his breath hot against her ear. "It is over, Lady Beatrice," he whispered. "You have lost." Suddenly, the door burst open, splintering wood flying across the room. Geoffrey stood in the doorway, his face a mask of fury, his sword dripping with blood. He took in the scene in an instant, his eyes locking with Osric's, his expression a mixture of disbelief and betrayal. "Osric," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "What have you done?" Osric released Beatrice, stepping back, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and defiance. "I was protecting you, Geoffrey," he said, his voice trembling. "She is a danger to us all. I had to get rid of her." Geoffrey advanced, his sword raised, his movements fluid and deadly. "You betrayed me," he said, his voice filled with a cold fury. "You betrayed my trust, my friendship, my love." The fight was short, brutal, and decisive. Osric, despite his treachery, was no match for Geoffrey's skill and rage. He fell, his body crumpling to the floor, his blood staining the stones of Ravenswood. Geoffrey stood over him, his chest heaving, his sword still raised. He looked at Beatrice, his eyes filled with a mixture of relief, sorrow, and a deep, abiding love. The price of loyalty had been paid, in blood and betrayal. And in the aftermath of the violence, a new understanding dawned, a recognition that the bonds forged in adversity were stronger, more enduring, than any that had come before. Chapter 10. Echoes of a Lost Love. The immediate threat within Ravenswood had been extinguished, but the larger battles still loomed. Osric's death, though necessary, cast a heavy pall over the fortress. He had been Geoffrey's cousin, his friend, and his betrayal cut deep, leaving a wound that would take time to heal. The sounds of the siege continued outside, a constant reminder of Elric's relentless pursuit. Geoffrey, though visibly shaken by Osric's treachery, remained focused on the defense of Ravenswood. He moved with a grim determination, his orders sharp and concise, his presence a source of strength and reassurance to his men. Beatrice, despite her own fear, tried to be a calming presence, helping Maud tend to the wounded, offering words of comfort to the women and children huddled within the keep. As the night wore on, the fighting intensified. Elric's forces, far outnumbering Joffrey's, pressed their attack, testing the defenses of Ravenswood at every point. The air was thick with smoke and the stench of blood, the cries of the wounded mingling with the roar of battle. Beatrice found herself drawn to the battlements, her gaze fixed on the chaotic scene below. She saw Joffrey, a figure of grim determination amidst the swirling melee, his sword flashing in the torchlight, his voice ringing out above the din, rallying his men. She watched him, her heart filled with a mixture of fear and admiration. She had never seen such courage, such unwavering resolve. He was fighting not just for his home, for his people, but for her, for the promise of a future they had only just begun to glimpse. Suddenly, a cry went up from the men around her. "They've breached the gate." Beatrice's heart leaped into her throat. She saw Elric's forces surging through the broken gate, their numbers overwhelming the defenders. She saw Joffrey, surrounded by enemies, fighting with a desperate ferocity. She had to do something, anything, to help him. She couldn't just stand there and watch him die. She turned, running back towards the keep, her mind racing. She had to find a weapon, a way to join the fight, to stand beside him, to share his fate, whatever it may be. As she reached the great hall, she saw it. Hanging above the fireplace, a relic of Ravenswood's past, was a sword. It was not the ornate, jewel-encrusted weapon of a courtly knight, but a blade that looked as if it had seen countless battles, its edge honed to a deadly sharpness. It was, she realized, the sword Joffrey's father had, a man of legendary honor. Without hesitation, she reached up, pulling the heavy sword from its mounting. It was heavier than she expected, but she gripped it firmly, her hands surprisingly steady. She had never wielded a sword before, but she knew, instinctively, that she would do whatever it took to protect the man she loved. As she turned to leave the hall, she saw something else, a small, intricately carved wooden box, tucked away on a shelf. She recognized it, instinctively. It was a box that belonged to Joffrey, a box he kept locked, a box he had never shown her. Curiosity, and a strange premonition, overcame her. She opened the box, her fingers trembling. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was a miniature portrait, a painting of a woman. The woman was beautiful, with long, dark hair and eyes the color of a summer sky. She wore a gown of blue silk, and a single strand of pearls adorned her neck. There was a sadness in her eyes, a hint of a melancholy that mirrored the shadows Beatrice had seen in Joffrey's own gaze. As Beatrice stared at the portrait, a wave of recognition washed over her. She knew this woman. Or rather, she knew her story. It was Lady Annalise, Joffrey's betrothed, the woman he had loved, the woman he had lost. The stories, whispered in hushed tones throughout the court, came flooding back to her. Annalise had been accused of infidelity, of betraying Joffrey with his own brother. She had died, tragically, before the truth could be revealed. Joffrey had been blamed, exiled, his heart broken, his reputation ruined. Now, holding the portrait in her hand, Beatrice understood. The echoes of a lost love still resonated within him, a constant reminder of the pain he had endured, the injustice he had suffered. She understood his reluctance to trust, his fear of vulnerability, his resistance to love. But she also knew that he had moved on, that he had begun to heal, that he had opened his heart to her, despite the risks, despite the shadows of the past. She closed the box, placing it back on the shelf. She would return it to him later, when the battle was over, when they had time to talk, to share their secrets, to heal their wounds. For now, she had a more immediate task. She gripped the sword, her resolve hardening. She would fight for him, for Ravenswood, for the future they had dared to dream of. She would face the echoes of the past, and she would help him to lay them to rest, once and for all. The sword felt heavy in her hand, but her heart felt light, filled with a newfound purpose, a fierce determination to protect the man she loved, the man who had shown her that even in the darkest of times, hope and love could still bloom. She ran back towards the battlements, the image of Annalise's face, a poignant reminder of the past, fueling her courage, her determination to fight for a future free from shadows, free from pain, free from the echoes of lost love. Chapter 11. The Tournament of Masks. Emerging onto the battlements, sword in hand, Beatrice was met with a scene of controlled chaos. The initial surge through the gate had been repelled, Geoffrey's men rallying with a ferocity born of desperation and loyalty. But Alric's forces were still numerous, and the fighting continued in pockets throughout the courtyard, a grim dance of steel and blood. Beatrice scanned the melee, searching for Geoffrey. She spotted him near the shattered remains of the gate, his back to a wall, his sword a blur as he defended himself against 3 attackers. He was tiring. She could see it in the set of his shoulders, the slight falter in his movements. She moved towards him, her heart pounding, her inexperienced grip on the sword surprisingly firm. She had no illusions about her skill, but she knew she had to reach him, to offer whatever assistance she could. As she approached, one of Geoffrey's attackers, a burly brute with a scarred face, saw her. He grinned, a cruel, predatory grin, and turned towards her, his sword raised. Well, he sneered. What have we here? A little bird come to play with the wolves? Beatrice stood her ground, her fear battling with a surge of adrenaline. Stay away from him, she said, her voice trembling, but her eyes fixed on his. He laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. And what will you do, little bird? Peck me to death. He lunged at her, his sword whistling through the air. Beatrice reacted instinctively, raising her own sword, blocking his blow. The impact jarred her arm, sending a shock of pain through her, but she held firm. She had never fought before, but she had watched Geoffrey, had observed his movements, had learned, instinctively, the basics of defense. She parried another blow, then another, her movements clumsy but surprisingly effective. She was buying time, giving Geoffrey a chance to recover, to regroup. She saw him dispatch one of his attackers, then another. He turned towards her, his eyes widening in surprise, then concern. Beatrice, he shouted, get back. This is not your fight. But she didn't retreat. She couldn't. She had to stand by him, to fight alongside him, to share his fate, whatever it may be. She ducked under another blow, her sword clashing against her attackers, sparks flying. She saw an opening, a brief moment of vulnerability, and she lunged, her sword finding its mark. The man cried out, stumbling back, his hand clutching his arm. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of surprise and pain. Beatrice stood over him, her chest heaving, her sword still raised. She had done it. She had defended herself. She had protected Geoffrey. He was at her side in an instant, his arm around her, pulling her close. Are you all right? He asked, his voice filled with concern. She nodded, her head resting against his chest, her body trembling with exhaustion and relief. I am, she whispered. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of admiration and awe. You were amazing, he said, his voice barely a whisper. You fought like a warrior. The battle still raged, the final clash far from over. The remaining enemy soldiers, after regrouping, advanced, led now by Lord Elric, a tall figure in silver and blue.
Geoffrey de Moray,
he thundered. Yield, and return what is mine. Geoffrey drew himself up. She came to me, seeking shelter of her own free will. She is under my protection, and I will not yield. Elric's lip curled in derision. Very well. It seems this conflict will be settled with a contest not of armies, but of champions. A tournament of masks. He gestured to his forces, and they parted, revealing a cleared circle in the courtyard. I challenge you, de Moray. Elric continued, his voice dripping with scorn. A single combat. Winner takes all. If you refuse, Ravenswood falls, and the woman is mine. Geoffrey's men murmured, fear and uncertainty etched on their faces. Their lord was skilled, yes, but weary from battle. Elric was fresh, and known for his ruthless prowess. Beatrice clutched Geoffrey's arm. No, she whispered. You cannot. He will kill you. Geoffrey looked at her, a strange light in his eyes. It is the only way, Beatrice.
To spare my people.
To protect you. He turned back to Elric. I accept your challenge. Elric smiled, a cold, cruel smile. Then let the tournament of masks begin. He pulled a dark, ornate helm from one of his retainers, donning it. The visor concealed his entire face. By old tradition, he proclaimed, neither combatant may reveal their true faces during the combat to reduce the possibility of grudges. We fight now, not as lords, but as skilled warriors. Geoffrey nodded, and one of his men brought him a similar helm, plain but sturdy. He, too, donned the visor, obscuring his features. The two men faced each other, their identities hidden, their fates hanging in the balance. It was a tournament of masks, a battle not just of skill, but of wills, of courage, of love and loyalty. And as Beatrice watched, her heart in her throat, she knew that the outcome would determine not just her future, but the future of Ravenswood, the future of the man she loved. The clang of their swords, meeting for the first time, echoed through the courtyard, a stark prelude to the deadly dance that was about to unfold. Chapter 12. Beneath a hunter's moon. The two masked figures circled each other, their swords held at the ready, their movements cautious and deliberate. The courtyard was silent, save for the crackling of torches and the heavy breathing of the combatants. The assembled men-at-arms, both Geoffrey's and Elric's, watched with bated breath, their faces grim, their hopes and fears hanging on every move, every parry, every thrust. Beatrice stood frozen, her gaze fixed on Geoffrey, her heart pounding in her chest. She could not see his face, but she knew him. She recognized his stance, his movements, the way he held his sword. She knew his strength, his skill, but she also knew his weariness, the toll the previous fighting had taken on him. Elric, in contrast, was fresh, his movements fluid and powerful. He was known for his ruthlessness, his skill with a blade, his willingness to use any means necessary to achieve victory. He was a formidable opponent, and Beatrice feared for Geoffrey's life. The fight began slowly, cautiously, a testing of each other's defenses, a probing for weaknesses. Elric was the aggressor, his attacks relentless, his sword a blur of motion. Geoffrey defended himself skillfully, parrying Elric's blows, deflecting his attacks, but he was clearly on the defensive, his movements growing slower, more labored. Beatrice watched, her breath caught in her throat, her hands clenched into fists. She wanted to scream, to cry out, to beg them to stop, but she knew she couldn't. This was Geoffrey's choice, his sacrifice, his way of protecting her, of protecting his people. As the fight wore on, the moon, full and bright, emerged from behind the clouds, casting a silvery glow over the courtyard, illuminating the masked figures, turning their armor into shimmering pools of light. It was a hunter's moon, a moon that traditionally signaled the time for pursuit, for capture, for the kill. Beneath that hunter's moon, the battle raged. Elric, sensing Geoffrey's fatigue, pressed his attack, his sword a relentless storm of steel. Geoffrey, his strength waning, fought with a desperate courage, his movements fueled by adrenaline, by his love for Beatrice, by his loyalty to his people. Suddenly, Elric feinted, a deceptive move designed to draw Geoffrey's defense, then lunged, his sword aimed at Geoffrey's heart. Beatrice gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, her eyes wide with horror. But Geoffrey, despite his weariness, anticipated the move. He sidestepped, narrowly avoiding the blow, then countered, his sword flashing in the moonlight, striking Elric's arm. Elric cried out, more in surprise than pain, and stumbled back, his sword arm hanging limp. He looked at Geoffrey, his masked face hiding his expression, but his body language spoke of shock, of disbelief. Geoffrey did not press his advantage. He stood his ground, his sword lowered, his chest heaving. He had won. He had defeated Elric. But he did not want to kill him. Yield, Geoffrey said, his voice, though muffled by the helmet, still carried a commanding tone. Yield, and I will spare your life. Elric hesitated, his body trembling with rage and humiliation. He looked at Geoffrey, then at Beatrice, his masked gaze lingering on her for a long moment. He knew he was defeated, that he had lost. "I yield," he said finally, his voice barely a whisper. The tension in the courtyard broke, a collective sigh of relief escaping the assembled men-at-arms. Geoffrey's men cheered, their voices hoarse with emotion, their loyalty to their lord reaffirmed. Geoffrey removed his helmet, his face pale and drawn, but his eyes shining with victory. He looked at Beatrice, a slow smile spreading across his face. She ran to him, her arms wrapping around him, her tears flowing freely. "You did it," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "You saved us." He held her close, his hand stroking her hair, his body trembling with exhaustion and relief. "We did it," he corrected, his voice husky. "Together." Elric, his own helmet removed, revealing a face contorted with rage and humiliation, was escorted away by his men, his dreams of conquest shattered, his pride wounded. He would return to Ashworth, defeated, his reputation tarnished. As the moon climbed higher in the sky, casting its silvery glow over Ravenswood, a new chapter began. The siege was over, the threat had been vanquished, the price of loyalty had been paid. But the echoes of the past still lingered, the scars of betrayal still remained. Geoffrey and Beatrice, standing together beneath that hunter's moon, knew that their journey was far from over. They had faced the darkness together, they had fought for their future, and they had won. But they also knew that the path ahead would be long and arduous, that they would face new challenges, new obstacles. But they would face them together, their love a beacon of hope, a source of strength, a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit. They had found each other in the midst of chaos, in the heart of darkness, and they would not let go. They would build a new life together, a life free from fear, free from shadows, free from the echoes of the past. They would create their own future, a future filled with hope, with love, with the promise of a new dawn. The hunter's moon, a witness to their struggle, now seemed to bless their union, their courage, their unwavering commitment to each other. Chapter 13. A choice made in haste. The immediate aftermath of Elric's defeat was a whirlwind of activity. Geoffrey, despite his exhaustion, oversaw the tending of the wounded, the repair of the damaged gate, and the securing of Ravenswood. He moved with a quiet authority, his presence reassuring his people, his leadership reaffirming their loyalty. Beatrice, too, was caught up in the flurry of activity, assisting Maud in the makeshift infirmary, offering comfort to the injured, her own anxieties and fears pushed aside in the face of the immediate needs of others. As the dust settled, however, a sense of unease began to creep back in. The victory had been hard-won, but the cost had been high. Osric's betrayal, though dealt with swiftly, had left a deep wound, a reminder of the fragility of trust, the ever-present threat of treachery, and the knowledge that Elric, though defeated, still lived, still posed a potential threat, hung heavy in the air. Geoffrey, too, seemed burdened by these concerns. He withdrew into himself, his usual stoicism replaced by a brooding silence. He spent hours alone, poring over maps, consulting with his remaining advisors, his face etched with worry. Beatrice tried to reach him, to offer comfort, to share her own fears and anxieties, but he seemed distant, unreachable. He would acknowledge her presence with a nod, a brief touch, but his mind was clearly elsewhere, preoccupied with the challenges that still lay ahead. One evening, as they sat together in the great hall, the remnants of the evening meal cleared away, Beatrice decided to confront him. "Geoffrey," she said, her voice soft but firm, "what is troubling you? You seem distant." He sighed, running a hand through his dark hair. "I am worried, Beatrice," he admitted. "Elric is defeated, but he is not destroyed. He will return, and next time he will be better prepared. He will have allies. We will be ready for him," she said, trying to sound confident, but her own fear echoed in her voice. He shook his head. "Ravenswood is vulnerable," he said. "We are outnumbered, outmatched. We cannot withstand another siege, not on our own." "What are you saying?" she asked, a knot of apprehension tightening in her stomach. He looked at her, his glacial eyes filled with a mixture of regret and determination.
I am saying that we need allies, he said.
We need a powerful protector, someone who can deter Elric, someone who can ensure the safety of Ravenswood, of my people, of you. Beatrice understood. He was talking about marriage, about a political alliance, about sacrificing their newfound love for the sake of security, for the sake of survival. And who do you have in mind? She asked, her voice barely a whisper, her heart sinking. He hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor. Lord Gareth of Northwood, he said finally. He is a powerful lord, a respected warrior. He has offered his protection, his support in exchange for a marriage alliance. Beatrice felt a chill run down her spine. Lord Gareth. She had heard of him, of course. He was a man of considerable influence, a man known for his military prowess, but also for his age. He was old enough to be her grandfather, a man with a reputation for coldness, for aloofness. But what about us? She asked, her voice trembling, her eyes filling with tears. What about what we feel for each other? He reached out, his hand gently touching her cheek, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw. I care for you deeply, Beatrice, he said, his voice husky. But I am responsible for the safety of my people. I must do what is best for them, even if it means sacrificing my own happiness. It was a noble sentiment, a selfless act, but it felt like a betrayal, a rejection of the love they had shared, the bond they had forged. In that moment, hurt and fueled by a desperate fear of losing him, Beatrice made a choice that would have far-reaching consequences, a choice that would alter the course of their lives forever. No, she said, her voice firm, her chin lifted in defiance. I will not let you do this. I will not let you sacrifice yourself, your happiness for me. I will leave Ravenswood. I will return to Blackmere. Geoffrey looked at her, his eyes widening in surprise, then disbelief.
What?
He exclaimed. You cannot. Elric will not harm me, she interrupted, her voice gaining strength. I am still betrothed to him, technically. I will accept my fate. I will marry him. It was a lie, a desperate gamble, a way to protect Geoffrey, to free him from the burden of her presence, to allow him to make the alliance he needed to secure Ravenswood's future. But it was also a betrayal of her own heart, a sacrifice of her own happiness, a surrender to the very fate she had fought so hard to escape. Geoffrey stared at her, his face a mask of shock and confusion. Beatrice, you cannot be serious, he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. You cannot go back to him. You know what he is like. I have no choice, she said, her voice trembling, but her resolve firm. It is the only way. It is the only way to protect you, to protect Ravenswood. She stood, her legs shaking, her heart breaking. I will leave in the morning, she said, her voice barely audible. She turned and fled the hall, her tears flowing freely, her heart shattered into a million pieces. She had made her choice, a choice made in haste, a choice born of fear and desperation, a choice that would seal her fate, and perhaps condemn her to a life of unhappiness, of regret. But she had done it for him, for Geoffrey, for the man she loved, for the man she was willing to sacrifice everything for. The choice, though devastating, was made. And as she collapsed onto her bed, sobbing uncontrollably, she knew that there was no turning back. The decision, made in a moment of anguish, echoed through the silent chambers of Ravenswood, a testament to the cruel choices love sometimes demanded. Chapter 14. The Gathering Storm. Beatrice's declaration, delivered with such heartbreaking finality, left Geoffrey reeling. He had not expected this, had not anticipated her willingness to sacrifice herself, to return to the very fate she had fled. He stood there, frozen, his mind struggling to comprehend the enormity of her decision, the depth of her love, the cruelty of the choice she had made. He ran after her, his footsteps echoing in the empty hall, his heart pounding in his chest. He found her in her chamber, the door closed but not locked. He pushed it open, his eyes searching for her in the dim light. She was sitting on the bed, her back to him, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. He approached her slowly, his heart aching for her pain, for the sacrifice she was willing to make. "Beatrice," he said softly, his voice filled with a mixture of tenderness and desperation. "You cannot do this. You cannot go back to him." She did not turn, did not acknowledge his presence. "I have made my decision, Geoffrey," she said, her voice muffled by her sobs. "It is the only way." He knelt beside her, his hand reaching out, gently touching her shoulder. She flinched, as if his touch burned her. "There is always another way," he said, his voice pleading. "We can find another solution. We can fight him together." She shook her head, her tears falling onto her hands, clasped tightly in her lap. "No," she whispered. "It is too dangerous. I will not risk your life, your people's lives, for my sake." He cupped her face in his hands, forcing her to look at him. Her eyes were red and swollen, her cheeks stained with tears, but there was a determination in her gaze, a resolve that he knew he could not break. "I love you, Beatrice," he said, his voice raw with emotion. "I cannot let you go. I cannot let you sacrifice yourself for me." She looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of love and sorrow. "And I love you, Geoffrey," she said, her voice barely audible. "That is why I must do this. That is why I must leave." He held her close, his arms wrapping around her, his body trembling with the force of his emotions. He kissed her, a desperate, passionate kiss that spoke of their love, their loss, their shared sorrow. But he knew he could not change her mind. She had made her choice, a choice born of love, of sacrifice, of a desperate desire to protect him, to protect Ravenswood. He released her, stepping back, his heart breaking. "If that is your decision," he said, his voice heavy with resignation, "then I will not stop you. But I will not let you go alone. I will escort you to Blackmere. I will ensure your safety, as far as I am able." She nodded, her tears still flowing, her gaze fixed on the floor. "Thank you," she whispered. They spent the rest of the night together, not speaking, not touching, but simply being there, in the same room, sharing the silence, the sorrow, the knowledge that their time together was coming to an end. As dawn broke, painting the sky in hues of pale gray and hesitant pink, Beatrice prepared to leave. She dressed in the same simple gown she had worn when she fled Blackmere, a poignant reminder of her journey, of the choices she had made, of the love she had found and lost. Geoffrey waited for her in the courtyard, his face grim, his eyes filled with a deep sadness. He had assembled a small escort, a handful of his most trusted men, to accompany them on their journey. They rode in silence, the only sound the clatter of hooves on the muddy track, the rustling of leaves in the wind, the occasional cry of a bird overhead. The landscape, once a symbol of freedom, of escape, now seemed bleak and unforgiving, a reflection of the despair that filled their hearts. As they rode, a storm gathered on the horizon, the sky darkening, the wind picking up, the air thick with the scent of rain. It was a reflection of the turmoil within them, the gathering storm of emotions, of regrets, of fears, of what the future held. The storm broke as they reached the borders of Blackmere, the rain lashing down, the wind howling, the thunder echoing through the hills. It was as if the very heavens were weeping for their loss, for the love that had been sacrificed, for the future that had been stolen. Geoffrey looked at Beatrice, his face pale and drawn, his eyes filled with a deep sorrow. "This is not the end," he said, his voice barely audible above the roar of the storm. "I will find a way. I will get you back." She smiled, a sad, wistful smile that did not reach her eyes. "I know," she whispered. And with that, she rode on, towards Blackmere, towards the fate she had chosen, towards the life she had escaped, but was now returning to willingly, for the sake of the man she loved. The storm raged around her, but she rode on, her back straight, her head held high, a figure of courage and sacrifice, disappearing into the mist and the rain, leaving Geoffrey behind, his heart broken, his future uncertain, his love undiminished. The gathering storm was a prelude to the battles yet to come, the challenges they would both face, separately, but with the memory of their love, a fragile but enduring flame, flickering in the darkness. Chapter 15. Betrayal's Bitter Sting. The return to Blackmere was a somber affair. Beatrice, escorted by Geoffrey and his men, was met at the gates by a contingent of Lord Elric's soldiers, their faces grim, their expressions unwelcoming. Lord Reginald, Beatrice's father, was conspicuously absent. Elric himself greeted them in the courtyard, his face a mask of cold satisfaction. He dismissed Geoffrey and his men curtly, his eyes lingering on Beatrice with a possessive gleam that sent a shiver of revulsion down her spine. "Welcome home, my dear," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "I trust you enjoyed your little adventure." Beatrice did not reply, her gaze fixed on the ground, her heart heavy with dread. She had returned to the cage she had so desperately tried to escape, a gilded cage, perhaps, but a prison nonetheless. Geoffrey, before he was forced to leave, grasped her hand, his touch brief, but conveying a world of unspoken promises and enduring love. He said nothing, but his eyes, filled with a mixture of sorrow and determination, spoke volumes. As he rode away, Beatrice felt a sense of utter desolation, a loneliness that cut deeper than any she had ever experienced. She was surrounded by familiar walls, by familiar faces, but she felt more alone than ever before. The following days were a blur of strained interactions and forced pleasantries. Lord Reginald, when he finally appeared, greeted her with a mixture of relief and disapproval. He was glad to have her back, of course, but he was also deeply disappointed by her defiance, by her rejection of the alliance he had so carefully arranged. "You have caused a great deal of trouble, Beatrice," he said, his voice weary. "Elric is a powerful man, a man not to be trifled with. You are fortunate that he is still willing to marry you." Beatrice knew that her father was right, but she could not bring herself to feel grateful. She was trapped, caught between her duty to her family and her love for Geoffrey, a love that now seemed like a distant, unattainable dream. The wedding preparations began immediately, a constant reminder of the fate that awaited her. Beatrice moved through the motions, a ghost of her former self, her heart numb, her spirit broken. She had made her choice, her sacrifice, and she would live with the consequences. One evening, as she was walking in the castle gardens, seeking a moment of solitude, she encountered Alara, the young kitchen maid who had helped her escape. Alara's face was pale and drawn, her eyes filled with fear. "My lady," she whispered, her voice trembling. I have something to tell you. Something terrible." Beatrice felt a knot of apprehension tighten in her stomach. "What is it, Alara?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Alara hesitated, glancing around nervously, as if afraid of being overheard. "It concerns your father, my lady," she said. And Lord Elric." Beatrice's heart began to pound. "What about them?" Alara took a deep breath, her voice shaking. I overheard them talking," she said. "They were plotting against Sir Geoffrey, against Ravenswood." Beatrice felt a chill run down her spine. "What do you mean?" Alara's eyes filled with tears. They planned to attack Ravenswood," she whispered. "To destroy it. To kill Sir Geoffrey. And your father, he agreed to it. He betrayed Sir Geoffrey." Beatrice felt as if the ground had opened up beneath her. Her father, the man she had always trusted, the man who had always claimed to be acting in her best interests, had betrayed her, had betrayed Geoffrey, had betrayed everything she held dear. "When?" she asked, her voice trembling, her mind racing. "When are they planning to attack?" "Soon, my lady," Alara said. "Very soon. They are gathering their forces now. They want to take Sir Geoffrey by surprise." Beatrice felt a surge of anger, of outrage, of a desperate need to act. She could not stand by and let this happen. She could not let her father, Elric, destroy the man she loved, the home she had found, the future she had dreamed of. She had to warn Geoffrey. She had to find a way to escape, to reach him, to tell him of the impending attack. She had made one sacrifice, a sacrifice of her own happiness, But she would not stand by and watch as everything she cared for was destroyed. She would fight, she would resist, she would betray her own family, if necessary, to protect the man she loved, to save Ravenswood. The betrayal's bitter sting had awakened a new resolve, a fierce determination to fight back, to reclaim her life, to choose her own destiny. She would not be a pawn, a victim, a sacrifice. She would be a warrior, a protector, a lover. And she would not rest until she had warned Geoffrey, until she had done everything in her power to save him, to save Ravenswood, to save the future they had dared to dream of. She looked at Alara, her eyes filled with a newfound determination. "Help me," she said, her voice firm. "Help me escape. Help me save Ravenswood." Alara nodded, her own fear replaced by a flicker of hope, a shared determination to fight against the injustice, the betrayal, that threatened to consume them all. The plan, desperate and dangerous, was hatched in the shadows of Blackmere, a testament to the enduring power of love, of loyalty, of the refusal to surrender, even in the face of overwhelming odds. Chapter 16. The Siege of Ravenswood. With Alara's help, Beatrice managed to slip away from Blackmere under the cover of darkness, leaving behind a hastily written note for her father, a message filled with both accusation and a desperate plea for understanding. She rode through the night, her heart pounding, her mind racing, the image of Geoffrey's face, his trusting eyes, fueling her determination. She reached Ravenswood just as dawn was breaking, the fortress a silhouette against the pale gray sky. She was met with a mixture of relief and alarm, her sudden appearance, her disheveled state, immediately raising concerns. Geoffrey, roused from his sleep, greeted her with a mixture of joy and disbelief. He held her close, his arms wrapping around her, his body trembling with the force of his emotions. "Beatrice," he whispered, his voice hoarse with emotion. "What are you doing here? What happened?" She told him everything, her words tumbling out in a rush, her voice filled with urgency. She told him of Elric's plot, of her father's betrayal, of the impending attack. Geoffrey listened in silence, his face hardening, his jaw tightening, his eyes turning to ice. He had suspected treachery, of course, but the confirmation, the knowledge that Beatrice's own father was involved, was a blow that struck deep. He did not waste time on recriminations, on anger, on sorrow. He immediately mobilized his forces, preparing for the inevitable siege. He knew that they were outnumbered, outmatched, but he would not surrender. He would fight, he would defend Ravenswood, he would protect his people, he would protect the woman he loved. The attack came swiftly, brutally. Elric's forces, augmented by Lord Reginald's men, swarmed Ravenswood, their numbers overwhelming the defenders. The sounds of battle echoed through the fortress, the clash of steel, the cries of men, the thud of bodies, a symphony of violence that threatened to consume them all. Beatrice, refusing to be confined to the keep, insisted on joining the fight. She donned a suit of light armor, borrowed from a young soldier, and wielding the sword she had taken from the Great Hall, she fought alongside Geoffrey, her courage fueled by her love for him, by her determination to protect their home. They fought back to back, a formidable pair, their movements synchronized, their skills complementing each other. Geoffrey, with his years of experience, was a force to be reckoned with, his sword a blur of motion, his attacks precise and deadly. Beatrice, despite her lack of training, fought with a fierce determination, her movements fueled by adrenaline, by her love for Geoffrey, by her desire for revenge. But despite their courage, despite their skill, they were losing. Elric's forces were simply too numerous, too relentless. The defenders of Ravenswood were being pushed back, their numbers dwindling, their strength waning. Geoffrey knew that they could not hold out much longer. He saw the exhaustion on his men's faces, the desperation in their eyes. He knew that they were on the verge of defeat. He looked at Beatrice, his eyes filled with a mixture of love and sorrow. "It is over," he said, his voice barely audible above the roar of battle. "We have lost." Beatrice shook her head, her eyes filled with tears, but her resolve unwavering.
"No," she said.
It is not over. We will not surrender.
We will fight until the end.
Suddenly, a cry went up from the battlements.
Look!
Geoffrey and Beatrice turned, their eyes following the direction of the cry. On the horizon, a cloud of dust, growing larger, closer, a sign of approaching riders. Hope surged through them, a flicker of light in the darkness. Could it be? Could it be reinforcements? As the riders drew closer, they could make out their banners, their colors, their crests. It was Lord Gareth of Northwood, the man Geoffrey had considered as an ally, the man Beatrice had refused to let him marry. Gareth, having received word of the attack, had ridden to Ravenswood's aid, not as a suitor, not as a political ally, but as a friend, a protector, a man who believed in justice, in loyalty, in love. His forces joined the battle, turning the tide, pushing back Elric's men, giving the defenders of Ravenswood a renewed sense of hope, a renewed surge of strength. The fighting continued, fierce and brutal, but now, the odds were more even. Geoffrey and Beatrice, fighting side by side, their love a beacon of hope amidst the chaos, inspired their men, rallied their forces, pushed back the enemy. Elric, seeing his victory slipping away, his plans thwarted, his ambition frustrated, charged towards Geoffrey, his sword raised, his face contorted with rage. "You will not win, de Moray," he screamed. "I will kill you, and I will take what is mine." Geoffrey met his charge, their swords clashing, sparks flying, their bodies locked in a deadly embrace. It was a fight to the death, a battle between two men, two rivals, two destinies. And in the end, it was Geoffrey who prevailed. With a final, desperate lunge, he disarmed Elric, his sword point at his throat. "It is over, Elric," he said, his voice cold and devoid of emotion. "Surrender." Elric, defeated, humiliated, his dreams shattered, his life spared, knelt before Geoffrey, his head bowed in submission. The battle was over. Ravenswood had been saved. The siege had been broken. Betrayal's bitter sting had been countered by the unwavering power of love, of loyalty, of courage. And as the sun set, casting a golden glow over the battered fortress, a new era began, an era of hope, of peace, of a future forged in the fires of adversity, a future where love, not duty, would reign supreme. Chapter 17. Blood and Ashes. The victory at Ravenswood was hard won, and the cost was etched on every face, every stone, every blood-stained patch of ground. While Elric had surrendered, the battle had claimed many lives, leaving a trail of grief and mourning throughout the fortress. Geoffrey, though victorious, was burdened by the losses, his usual stoicism giving way to a visible weariness. He moved among his people, offering comfort, overseeing the burial of the dead, his presence a somber reassurance in the face of so much loss. Beatrice, too, was deeply affected by the aftermath of the battle. She had fought bravely, fiercely, but the reality of death, the sight of so much suffering, left her shaken. She helped Maud tend to the remaining wounded, her hands gentle, her heart heavy with sorrow. One of the most devastating blows was the news regarding Lord Reginald. He had been found among the fallen, his body pierced by multiple arrows. Whether he had been targeted deliberately or had simply been caught in the crossfire was unclear, but the result was the same. Beatrice's father was dead. She received the news with a mixture of grief, anger, and a profound sense of betrayal. Her father, the man she had once trusted, had sided with her enemy, had plotted against the man she loved, had ultimately paid the price for his treachery. Geoffrey found her in the chapel, kneeling before the altar, her body racked with silent sobs. He knelt beside her, his arm wrapping around her, offering comfort, sharing her grief. "I am so sorry, Beatrice," he said, his voice husky with emotion. I know how much he meant to you." She looked at him, her eyes filled with tears. "He betrayed you," she whispered. "He betrayed us all." "He made his choices," Geoffrey said, his voice firm. "And he paid the price. But he was still your father. And it is right to mourn him." They remained there, in the silence of the chapel, their grief a shared burden, their love a source of strength in the face of so much loss. The days that followed were filled with the grim tasks of rebuilding, of burying the dead, of trying to piece together a semblance of normalcy amidst the ruins. Ravenswood, though scarred, had survived. And its people, though grieving, were resilient, their spirit unbroken. Lord Gareth, having played a crucial role in the victory, remained at Ravenswood for a time, offering his support, his counsel, his friendship. He was a man of honor, of integrity, and he had proven his loyalty, not just to Geoffrey, but to the ideals of justice and compassion. He spoke to Beatrice privately, offering his condolences for her father's death, his understanding of her complex emotions. "You are a brave woman, Lady Beatrice," he said, his voice kind. "You have endured much, and you have shown great courage. You have a good heart and a strong spirit. Do not let grief consume you. Do not let bitterness poison your soul." Beatrice was touched by his words, by his genuine concern. She realized that he was right. She could not let the past, the betrayals, the losses define her. She had to move forward, to rebuild, to embrace the future, however uncertain it may be. As the days turned into weeks, the wounds of Ravenswood began to heal. The fortress was repaired, the defenses strengthened, the spirits of its people slowly lifted. Life, though forever changed, began to return to a semblance of normalcy. One evening, as Geoffrey and Beatrice stood together on the battlements, watching the sun set over the distant hills, he turned to her, his eyes filled with a mixture of love and a lingering sadness. "The ashes have settled, Beatrice," he said, his voice low. "But the scars remain. We have much to rebuild, much to heal." She nodded, her hand reaching for his, their fingers intertwining. "We will do it together," she said, her voice firm. "We will face the future, whatever it may hold, side by side." He smiled, a slow, tentative smile that reached his eyes. "Together," he repeated. And as they stood there, bathed in the golden light of the setting sun, they knew that their journey was far from over. They had faced death, betrayal, loss, but they had also found love, loyalty, courage. They had survived the storm, and they had emerged stronger, more resilient, their bond unbreakable. The blood and ashes of the past would serve as a reminder of the sacrifices made, the battles fought, the price of freedom. But they would also serve as a foundation for a new beginning, a new chapter, a future where love, not duty, would guide their path, where hope, not fear, would light their way. Chapter 18. A Knight's Redemption. With Elric defeated and Ravenswood secured, a new challenge arose. Geoffrey standing in the eyes of the king. His exile, though largely ignored in the remote north, remained a legal reality. The accusations of treason, though unproven, still hung over him, a shadow that threatened his legitimacy and the future of Ravenswood. Lord Gareth, recognizing both the injustice and the political instability this represented, offered his assistance. He proposed traveling to the royal court to speak on Geoffrey's behalf, to present the evidence of his loyalty, of his defense of Ravenswood against Elric, of his worthiness to be reinstated as a knight of the realm. Geoffrey, though hesitant to trust the king who had once condemned him, recognized the necessity of Gareth's offer. He agreed, reluctantly, knowing that his future and Beatrice's depended on clearing his name, on reclaiming his honor. Before Gareth departed, he spoke to Geoffrey and Beatrice privately, his words both encouraging and cautionary. "The king is a fickle man," he said, his voice grave. "He is easily swayed by whispers, by rumors, by the machinations of his advisers. But he also respects strength, loyalty, and courage. You have shown all three, Geoffrey. I will do my best to convince him of your worthiness." He turned to Beatrice, his expression softening. "You, Lady Beatrice, are a powerful advocate in your own right," he said. "Your presence at Geoffrey's side, your unwavering support, will speak volumes. But be prepared for scrutiny, for judgment, for the whispers of the court." Beatrice nodded, her resolve firm. She had faced adversity before, and she would face it again, alongside the man she loved. Gareth's departure left a void at Ravenswood, a sense of uncertainty hanging in the air. Geoffrey, though outwardly calm, was clearly anxious, his mind preoccupied with the impending judgment, with the potential consequences of failure. Beatrice did her best to support him, to offer comfort, to reassure him of her unwavering belief in him. She spent hours with him in the great hall, poring over old documents, searching for any evidence that might support his case, any scrap of information that might sway the king in his favor. One evening, as they were working late into the night, Beatrice stumbled upon a hidden compartment in an ancient chest, a compartment that had been overlooked for years. Inside, she found a rolled-up parchment, tied with a faded ribbon. She carefully unrolled the parchment, her heart pounding with anticipation. It was a letter, written in a familiar hand, a hand she recognized from Geoffrey's father's sword hilt in the hall. It was a letter from Geoffrey's father, to his brother, the man Geoffrey had been accused of murdering. As Beatrice read the letter, her eyes widened in disbelief. The letter revealed the truth, the long-hidden secret that had led to Geoffrey's exile, to his brother's death, to the accusations of treason. The letter spoke of a plot, a conspiracy against the king, a plot orchestrated not by Geoffrey, but by his own brother and by a group of ambitious nobles, seeking to overthrow the king and seize power for themselves. Geoffrey's father, loyal to the king, had discovered the plot and had written to his brother, warning him, urging him to abandon his treasonous plans. The letter ended abruptly, unfinished, as if the writer had been interrupted, his life cut short before he could complete his message. Beatrice realized the significance of her discovery. This letter was the proof, the irrefutable evidence of Geoffrey's innocence, the key to his redemption. She showed the letter to Geoffrey, her hands trembling with excitement. He read it slowly, carefully, his face paling, his eyes widening in disbelief. This changes everything," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "This proves my innocence. This clears my name." He looked at Beatrice, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and awe.
"You found it," he said. "You saved me."
She smiled, her heart filled with joy. "We saved each other," she corrected. The discovery of the letter changed everything. It gave them hope, a renewed sense of purpose, a belief that justice would prevail. Geoffrey, armed with this new evidence, decided to travel to the royal court himself, to confront the king, to demand a hearing, to present the proof of his innocence. Beatrice, despite the dangers, insisted on accompanying him. She would not let him face this challenge alone. She would stand by his side, she would support him, she would fight for him, whatever the cost. They set off for the royal court, their hearts filled with a mixture of trepidation and determination. They knew that they were facing a formidable challenge, that the king was a fickle and unpredictable man, that the court was a viper's nest of intrigue and betrayal. But they also knew that they had truth on their side, that they had the evidence of Geoffrey's innocence, that they had each other. And that, they believed, was enough. The journey to the court was long and arduous, but their spirits remained high, their resolve unwavering. They were fighting for their future, for their love, for the redemption of a knight, for the restoration of his honor. And they would not rest until they had achieved their goal, until Geoffrey had been cleared of all charges, until he had been reinstated as a knight of the realm, until they could finally, truly, be free. A knight's redemption was at hand, and Beatrice, the woman who had loved him through exile and battle, would be there to witness it, to share in his triumph, to stand by his side, forever. Chapter 19. The Unveiling of Truth. The arrival at the royal court was a stark contrast to the quiet, isolated life Beatrice had grown accustomed to at Ravenswood. The court was a whirlwind of activity, a cacophony of sounds, a kaleidoscope of colors, a breeding ground for intrigue and whispers. Courtiers, dressed in silks and velvets, their faces adorned with masks of polite civility, eyed Geoffrey and Beatrice with a mixture of curiosity, suspicion, and thinly veiled contempt. Geoffrey, despite his years of exile, carried himself with a quiet dignity, his head held high, his eyes unwavering. He was no longer the disgraced knight, the outcast, the wolf of the north. He was Sir Geoffrey de Moray, a man seeking justice, a man determined to reclaim his honor. Beatrice, at his side, mirrored his strength, her presence a silent testament to her unwavering support, her love, her belief in his innocence. She wore a simple but elegant gown of deep blue, the color of loyalty, the color of truth. They requested an audience with the king. Their request met with a mixture of bureaucratic delays and thinly veiled hostility. The court, it seemed, was not eager to welcome back the exiled knight, the man who had been accused of treason. But Geoffrey, with the help of Lord Gareth, who had paved the way for their arrival, persisted. He presented the letter, the irrefutable evidence of his innocence, to the king's advisers, demanding a fair hearing, a chance to clear his name. Finally, after days of waiting, of uncertainty, of navigating the treacherous currents of courtly intrigue, they were granted an audience with the king. The king, a man in his late 50s, his face etched with the lines of power and weariness, received them in the great hall, surrounded by his advisers, his courtiers, his guards. He looked at Geoffrey with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion, his eyes cold and calculating. "Sir Geoffrey de Moray," he said, his voice echoing through the hall. "You have returned. After years of exile, you have dared to show your face at my court. What is it you seek?" Geoffrey stepped forward, his voice clear and firm. "I seek justice, your majesty," he said. "I seek to clear my name, to reclaim my honor, to prove my innocence of the charges that were laid against me." The king raised an eyebrow, a flicker of amusement, or perhaps disbelief, crossing his features. "Innocence?" he said. "You were accused of treason, of plotting against your king, of murdering your own brother. The evidence was compelling. The evidence was false, your majesty," Geoffrey said, his voice unwavering. "Manufactured by those who sought to benefit from my downfall. I have proof, irrefutable proof, of my innocence." He presented the letter, his father's letter, to the king, explaining its contents, its significance, its power to reveal the truth. The king took the letter, his eyes scanning the faded parchment, his expression unreadable. The hall was silent, save for the crackling of the torches, the rustling of silks, the heavy breathing of those assembled. As the king read, his expression slowly changed. The coldness in his eyes gave way to a flicker of surprise, then disbelief, then understanding. He looked up, his gaze fixed on Geoffrey, his voice softer now, less hostile. "This letter," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "It speaks of a plot, a conspiracy against me?" "Yes, your majesty," Geoffrey said. "A plot orchestrated by my brother and by others who sought to overthrow you and seize power for themselves. My father, loyal to you, discovered the plot and tried to warn my brother, to dissuade him from his treasonous plans." The king was silent for a long moment, his mind clearly struggling to comprehend the enormity of the revelation, the implications of the truth. He then turned to his advisers, his eyes narrowed, his voice filled with a sudden, fierce anger. "Who knew of this?" he demanded. "Who knew of this plot, of this letter, of this betrayal?" The advisers, their faces pale, their eyes wide with fear, stammered and hesitated, their carefully constructed masks of loyalty crumbling before the king's wrath. One by one, the truth began to emerge. The names of the conspirators, long dead, were revealed. The extent of their treachery, their manipulation, their lies, was exposed. The king, his face a mask of fury, ordered the arrest of those who had been complicit in the plot, those who had concealed the truth, those who had benefited from Geoffrey's downfall. He then turned back to Geoffrey, his expression softening, his voice filled with a mixture of regret and admiration. "Sir Geoffrey de Moray," he said, his voice ringing through the hall. "You have been wronged. You have been unjustly accused, unfairly exiled. You have suffered greatly, and you have endured with courage, with honor, with unwavering loyalty. I hereby reinstate you as a knight of the realm. I restore to you your titles, your lands, your honor, and I offer you my deepest apologies." A collective gasp went up from the assembled courtiers, their faces a mixture of shock, disbelief, and grudging respect. Geoffrey bowed his head, his heart filled with a mixture of relief, gratitude, and a profound sense of vindication. "Thank you, your majesty," he said, his voice choked with emotion. The king then turned to Beatrice, his eyes acknowledging her presence, her role in Geoffrey's redemption. "And you, Lady Beatrice," he said, his voice kind. "You have shown great courage, great loyalty, great love. You have stood by Sir Geoffrey through thick and thin, and you have played a crucial role in unveiling the truth. You are a woman of exceptional spirit, and you are worthy of great respect." Beatrice curtsied, her heart filled with joy, with pride, with a deep sense of satisfaction. The unveiling of truth had been achieved. Justice had prevailed. Geoffrey's name had been cleared, his honor restored. And as they stood together, in the great hall of the royal court, surrounded by the whispers of courtiers, the admiration of their allies, the envy of their enemies, they knew that their journey had finally reached its end. They had faced adversity, betrayal, loss, but they had emerged victorious, their love strengthened, their bond unbreakable. The truth, long hidden, had finally been revealed, and it had set them free. Chapter 20. The Winter Lord's Embrace. With Geoffrey's name cleared and his honor restored, they returned to Ravenswood, not as exiles, not as fugitives, but as heroes, welcomed back with open arms, with cheers of joy, with tears of relief. The fortress, once a symbol of isolation and defiance, now felt like a true home, a haven of peace and security. The whispers that had once followed them, whispers of suspicion and doubt, were replaced by whispers of admiration and respect. Geoffrey, no longer the Wolf of the North, the exiled knight, was now Sir Geoffrey de Moray, a respected lord, a trusted advisor to the king, a symbol of justice and redemption. Beatrice, too, was embraced by the people of Ravenswood, her courage, her loyalty, her unwavering support of Geoffrey earning her their affection and their respect. She was no longer the outsider, the runaway bride, but Lady Beatrice, the heart of Ravenswood, the woman who had stood by her lord through thick and thin, the woman who had helped to save them all. The winter months that followed were a time of healing, of rebuilding, of strengthening the bonds that had been forged in the fires of adversity. Geoffrey, with the king's blessing and support, set about improving the lives of his people, expanding the lands of Ravenswood, strengthening its defenses, ensuring its prosperity. Beatrice, at his side, took on the role of Lady of Ravenswood, overseeing the household, caring for the sick and the needy, her gentle touch and compassionate heart bringing warmth and comfort to all. They worked together, side by side, their love a constant source of strength, their shared vision a guiding light. They had faced darkness, betrayal, loss, but they had emerged stronger, more resilient, their bond unbreakable. One cold, crisp winter evening, as the snow fell softly outside, blanketing the landscape in a layer of white, Geoffrey and Beatrice stood together before the hearth in the great hall, their arms wrapped around each other, their hearts filled with a deep and abiding love. "We have come a long way, Beatrice," Geoffrey said, his voice low and husky, his breath warm against her ear. She nodded, her head resting against his chest, her eyes gazing into the flickering flames. "We have," she agreed. "We have faced so much, endured so much, but we have done it together." He kissed her, a tender, passionate kiss that spoke of their love, their journey, their shared future. "I love you, Beatrice," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "I love you more than words can say." "And I love you, Geoffrey," she replied, her voice trembling with emotion. "With all my heart, with all my soul." He held her close, his arms a protective embrace, his heart overflowing with love. He had found his home, his haven, his true love, in the heart of the woman who had stood by him, who had believed in him, who had fought for him. He had been the Wolf of the North, the exiled knight, the man burdened by the shadows of the past. But now, he was simply Geoffrey, a man in love, a man at peace, a man with a future filled with hope, with promise, with the unwavering embrace of the woman he loved. As the snow continued to fall, blanketing Ravenswood in a layer of white, They stood together, their love a beacon of warmth, a testament to their resilience, their courage, their unwavering commitment to each other. The Winter Lord had found his embrace, not in the cold, harsh landscape of the north, but in the heart of the woman who had captured his soul, who had shared his journey, who had become his everything. The long journey was over. The battles had been fought, the victories won, the losses mourned. And now, as they stood together, in the warmth of their home, in the embrace of their love, they knew that their future, however uncertain it may be, would be a future filled with hope, with joy, with the enduring power of their bond. They had found their happily ever after, not in a fairy tale castle, but in a fortress forged in adversity, in a love born of courage, in a future built on trust and unwavering devotion. They were home, together, and that was all that mattered. The Winter Lord's embrace was complete, a testament to the enduring power of love, of loyalty, of the human spirit.
Epilogue.
Years passed, seasons turning, painting the landscape of Ravenswood in hues of vibrant life and quiet dormancy. The scars of the past, both physical and emotional, gradually faded, replaced by the gentle patina of time, of shared experiences, of a love that deepened with each passing year. Geoffrey and Beatrice ruled Ravenswood wisely and justly, their names whispered with respect and affection throughout the north. They were known not for their titles, not for their power, but for their compassion, their fairness, their unwavering commitment to their people. Children were born, their laughter echoing through the halls of Ravenswood, their presence a testament to the enduring strength of their parents' love, a symbol of hope for the future. They grew up hearing tales of their parents' courage, of their resilience, of their unwavering devotion to each other. The story of the exiled knight and the runaway bride became a legend, whispered around firesides, recounted in songs, passed down through generations. It was a story of love, of betrayal, of redemption, a story of how two souls, destined for different paths, found each other in the midst of chaos, in the heart of darkness, and forged a future together, a future brighter than either could have imagined. One crisp autumn evening, as the leaves turned golden and the air carried the scent of wood smoke, Geoffrey and Beatrice, their hair now streaked with silver, their faces etched with the lines of time, but their eyes still shining with the same love and devotion, stood together on the battlements of Ravenswood, watching the sun set over the distant hills. They had lived a long and full life, a life filled with both joy and sorrow, with both triumphs and challenges. They had faced adversity together, they had overcome obstacles, they had built a legacy of love, of loyalty, of unwavering commitment to each other. Geoffrey, his hand reaching for hers, their fingers intertwining, a gesture so familiar, so comforting, so deeply ingrained in their shared existence. "We did it, Beatrice," he said, his voice soft, his eyes filled with a deep and abiding love. "We built a life together, a home, a family. We defied the odds. We overcame the obstacles. We found our happiness." Beatrice nodded, her head resting against his shoulder, her heart overflowing with gratitude, with contentment, with a love that had endured the test of time. "We did," she agreed, her voice barely a whisper. "And I wouldn't trade it for anything." They stood there, in silence, their bodies close, their hearts beating as one, watching as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange, purple, and gold. It was a breathtaking sight, a reminder of the beauty of the world, of the enduring power of nature, of the enduring power of love. As the last rays of sunlight faded and the stars began to appear, twinkling in the darkening sky, they turned and walked back towards the keep, their arms wrapped around each other, their steps slow but steady. They were old, yes, but their love was as strong as ever, their bond unbreakable. They had lived their lives to the fullest. They had loved each other fiercely. They had built a legacy that would endure for generations to come. And as they entered the warmth of their home, the place where their journey had begun, the place where their love had blossomed, they knew that their story, though coming to an end, would live on, a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit, of the enduring power of love. They were content. They were at peace. They were home.
Together.
The end.